Section 66 of All About Coffee. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Read by Matea Bracic. All About Coffee by William Ukers. World's Coffee Manners and Customs, Part 3. Coffee Making in Europe. In Europe, the coffee drink was first sold by lemonade vendors. In Florence, those who sold coffee, chocolate, and other beverages were not called caffettieri, coffee sellers, but limonaggi, lemonade vendors. Pascal's first Paris coffee shop served other drinks as well as coffee, and Procope's café began as a lemonade shop. It was only when coffee, which was an afterthought, began to lead the other beverages that he gave the name café to his whole refreshment place. Today, nearly every country in Europe can supply the two extremes of coffee making. In Paris and Vienna, one may find it brewed and served in its highest perfection, but here too it is frequently found as badly done as in England, and that is saying a good deal. The principal difficulty seems to be in the chicory flavor, for which long years of use has cultivated a taste with most people. Now, coffee and chicory is not at all a bad drink. Indeed, the author confesses to have developed a certain liking for it after a time in France, but it is not coffee. In Europe, chicory is not regarded as an adulterant. It is an addition, or modifier, if you please. And so many people have acquired a coffee and chicory taste that it is doubtful if they would appreciate a real cup of coffee should they ever meet it. This, of course, is a generalization, and like all generalizations, is dangerous, for it is possible to obtain good coffee properly made in any European country, even England, in the homes of the people, but seldom in the hotels or restaurants. Austria. Coffee is made in Austria after the French style, usually by the drip method or in the pumping percolator device, commonly called the Vienna coffee machine. The restaurants employ a large-size urn fitted with a combination metal sieve and cloth sack. After the ground coffee has infused for about 6 minutes, a screw device raises the metal sieve, the pressure forcing the liquid through the cloth sack containing the ground coffee. Vienna cafes are famous, but the World War has dimmed their glory. It used to be said that their equal could not be found for general excellence and moderate prices. From 8:30 to 10 in the morning, large numbers of people were wont to breakfast in them on a cup of coffee or tea, with a roll and butter. Melange is with milk, brown coffee is darker, and a schwarze is without milk. In all the cafes, the visitor may obtain coffee, tea, liquors, ices, bottled beer, ham, eggs, etc. The Café Schrangel in the Graben is typical. Then there are the dairies with coffee, a unique institution. In the Prater, public park, there are many interesting cafes. Charles J. Rosebolt says in the New York Times, "The Café of Vienna has been imitated all over the world, but the result has never failed to be an imitation. The nearest approach to the genuine, in my experience, was the upstairs room of the old Fleischmann Café in New York. That was because the average New Yorker knew it not, and it remained sacred to the internationalists, the musicians, artists, writers, and other bohemians to whom had been entrusted the secret of its existence. It's the spirit that counts, and it was the spirit of its frequenters that made the Vienna Café. It was every man's club, and every woman's too, where one went to relax and forget all the worries of existence, to look over papers and magazines from all parts of the world and printed in every known language, to play chess or scat or tarock, to chat with friends, and to drink the inimitable Viennese coffee, the fragrance of which can no more be described than the perfume of last year's violets. The café was filled after the noon meal, when busy men took their coffee and smoked. Again, around 5 o'clock, when all the world and his wife paraded along the Graben and the Kärtnerstrasse, and then dropped into a favorite café for coffee or chocolate and cakes, horns and crescents of delicious dough filled with jam, or possibly the wonderful Kugelhupf, in comparison with which our sponge is like unto lead. Finally, in the evening, when there were family parties and those returning from theaters and concerts and opera. While the cafe life of Vienna has been nearly killed by the World War, it is to be hoped that time will restore at least something of its former glory. In spite of the stories of plundering bands of Bolshevists that in the latter part of 1921 wrecked some of the better-known places, we read that Oscar Strauss, composer of The Chocolate Soldier, is living in comparative luxury in Vienna and spends most of his time in the cafes, where he is to be found usually from 2 until 5 in the afternoon and from 11 o'clock at night until some early hour of the morning, surrounded by musicians of lesser note and wealth, whom, to a degree, he supports. Also with him being many of the leading composers, librettists, actors, actresses, and singers of Vienna. For Vienna coffee, the liquor is usually made in a pumping percolator or by the drip process. In normal times, it is served 2 parts coffee to 1 of hot milk, topped with whipped cream. During 1914 to 18 and the recent post-war period, however, the sparkling crown of delicious whipped cream gave way to condensed milk, and saccharin took the place of sugar. Belgium. In Belgium, the French drip method is most generally employed. Chicory is freely used as a modifier. The greatest coffee drinker among reigning monarchs is said to be the King of the Belgians. His Majesty takes a cup of coffee before breakfast, after breakfast, at his noonday meal, in the afternoon, after dinner, and again in the evening. British Isles. In the British Isles, coffee is still being boiled, although the infusion, true percolation, drip, and filtration methods have many advocates. A favorite device is the earthenware jug with or without the cotton sack that makes it a coffee biggin. When used without the sack, the best practice is first to warm the jug. For each pint of liquor, 1 ounce, 3 dessert spoonfuls of freshly ground coffee is put in the pot. Upon it is poured freshly boiling water, 3/4 of the amount required. After stirring with a wooden spoon, the remainder of the water is poured in, and the pot is returned to the hob to infuse, and to settle for from 3 to 5 minutes. Some stir it a second time before the final settling. The best trade authorities stress home grinding and are opposed to boiling the beverage. They advocate also its use as a breakfast beverage after lunch and after the evening meal. From an American point of view, the principal defects in the English method of making coffee lie in the roasting, handling, and brewing. It has been charged that the beans are not properly cooked in the first place and that they are too often stale before being ground. The English run to a light or cinnamon roast, whereas the best American practice requires a medium, high, or city roast. A fairly high shade of brown is favored on the South Downs, with a light shade for Lancashire, the West Riding of Yorkshire, and the south of Scotland. The trade demands, for the most part, a ripe chestnut brown. Wholesale roasting is done by gas and coke machines, while retail dealers use mostly a small type of inner heated gas machine. The large gas machines, with capacities running from 25 to 700 pounds, have external air blast burners, direct and indirect burners, sliding burners, etc. The best known are the Falder and Morwood machines. In the Uno, a popular retail machine, roasting 7 to 14 pounds at a time, the coffee beans are placed in the space between outer and inner concentric cylinders, one made of perforated steel and the other of wire gauze revolving together. A gas flame of the Bunsen type burns inside the inner cylinder, its heat traversing the outer or coffee cylinder, while the fumes are driven off through the open ends. The roasting coffee may be viewed through a mica or wire gauze panel inserted in the wall of the outer cylinder. The Falder machine has an external flame, a capacity of from 7 to 14 pounds. And there are quick gas machines with capacities ranging from 3 pounds to 224 pounds for the retail trade. In recent years, there has been a marked improvement in English coffee roasting. Due to the intelligent study brought to bear upon the subject by leaders of the trade's thought and by the retail distributor, who, in the person of the retail grocer, is, generally speaking, better educated to his business than the retail grocer in any other country. Years ago, it was the practice to use butter or lard to improve the appearance of the bean in roasting, but this is not so common as formerly. The British customer, however, will need much instruction before the national character of the beverage shows a uniform improvement. While the coffee may be more carefully roasted, better cooked than it was formerly, it is still remaining too long unsold after roasting, or else it is being ground too long a time before making. These abuses are, however, being corrected, and the customer is everywhere being urged to buy his coffee freshly roasted and to have it freshly ground. Another factor has undoubtedly contributed to give England a bad name among lovers of good coffee, and that is certain tinned coffees, composed of ground coffee and chicory, mixtures that attained some vogue for a time as French coffee. They found favor perhaps because they were easily handled. Packaged coffees have not been developed in England as in America, but there is a more or less limited field for them, and there are several good brands of absolutely pure coffee on the market. The demi-tasse is a popular drink after luncheon, after dinner, and even during the day, especially in the cities. In London, there are cafes that make a specialty of it. Places like Peel's, Groom's, and the Café Nero in the city. Also the shops of the London Cafe Company and Ye Mecca Company. While in the home it is customary to steep the coffee. In hotels and restaurants, some form of percolating apparatus, extractor, or steam machine is employed. There are the Criterion, employing a drip tray for making coffee in the Etzenberger style, Fountain, Plateau, Siphon, Napier, and Verithing extractors, put out by Summerling and Company of London, and the well-known J&S rapid coffee-making machine having an infuser and producing coffee by steam pressure manufactured by W.M. Still & Sons Limited, London. American visitors complain that coffee in England is too thick and syrupy for their liking. Coffee in restaurants is served white with milk or black in earthen, stoneware, or silver pots. In chain restaurants like Lyons or the ABC, there is to be found on the tariff hot milk with a dash of coffee. As to the boiling method, this is already generally discredited in the countries of Western Europe. The steeping method, so much favored in England, may be responsible for some of the unkind things said about English coffee, because it undoubtedly leads to the abuse of over-infusion, so that the net result is as bad as boiling. The vast majority of the English people are, however, confirmed tea drinkers, and it is extremely doubtful if this national habit, ingrained through centuries of use of the cup that cheers at breakfast and at tea time in the afternoon, can ever be changed. As already mentioned in this work, the London coffee houses of the 17th and 18th century gave way to a type of coffee house whose mainstay was its food rather than its drink. In time, these too began to yield to the changing influences of a civilization that demanded modern hotels, luxurious tea lounges, smart restaurants, chain shops, tea rooms, and cafes with and without coffee. A certain type of coffee shop with rough boarded stalls, sanded floors, and private rooms frequented by the lower-class working men were to be found in England for a time. But because of their doubtful character, they were closed up by the police. Among other places in London where coffee may be had in English or continental style, mention should be made of the Café Monaco, a good place to drop in for a coffee and liquor, and one of the pioneers of the modern restaurant. Gatti's, where the Café Filtre, or coffee produced by the filtration method, is a specialty. The Cosmopolitan Savoy, with its popular tea lounge, teas 60 cents. The Piccadilly Hotel, with its Louis XIV restaurant catering to refined and luxurious tastes. The Waldorf Hotel, with its American clientele and its Palm Court, teas 36 cents. The Cecil, with its palm court and tea balcony, also having a special attraction for Americans. Lyon's Popular Cafe, iced coffee, 12 cents. The Trocadero, with its special Indian curries prepared by native cooks once each week. The Temple Bar Restaurant, an attractive refectory owned by the semi-philanthropic Trust Houses Limited, which runs some 200 similar establishments throughout the country, serving alcoholic drinks but stressing non-intoxicating beverages, among them special mocha at 6 and 8 cents a cup. Slater's Limited, catering mostly to business folk in the city, there being about a score of restaurants and tea rooms under this name with retail shops attached. The British Tea Table Association, like Slater's, a grown-up sister of the Olden Bun Shop of Queen Victoria's Day, and the Cardamom chain of cafes, where one is reasonably sure to get a satisfying cup of coffee and a cake. Supplementing the above, Charles Cooper, sometime editor of the Epicure and the Table, has prepared for this work some notes on the evolution of the old-time London coffee houses into the present-day tea rooms, tea lounges, cafes, and restaurants for all comers. Mr. Cooper says of the transformation: "The old-fashioned London coffee house that flourished 40 to 50 years ago has within the past 30 years been completely extinguished by the modern tea rooms. These old-fashioned establishments were mainly situated in and about the Strand and Fleet Street, the neighbourhood of the Inns of Court, etc. They did not sacrifice much to outside show and decoration. They were divided into boxes or pews and were generally speaking clean and well ordered. The prices were moderate, and the fare simple but superlatively good. There is nothing to equal it now. Chops were cooked in the grill, the tea and coffee were of the best, the hams were York hams, and the bacon the best Wiltshire. They were the last places where real buttered toast was made. The art is now lost. They catered exclusively to men, and their clientele consisted of journalists, artists, actors, men from the Inns of Court, students, et aliter. A man living in chambers could breakfast comfortably at one of these places and read all the morning papers at his ease. The most westerly, perhaps, of the old houses was Stone's in Panton Street, Haymarket, which has recently been sold. Groom's in Fleet Street, where a good cup of coffee may still be had, is principally frequented by barristers about the luncheon hour. They are usually men who lunch lightly. The tea rooms, as I have said, have killed the coffee houses. At the time the latter flourished, there were no facilities in London for a woman, unattended by a man, to obtain refreshment beyond a weak cup of tea at a few confectioners. It mattered the less in the days when the girl clerk had not come into being. When the field of women's employment widened, fresh requirements were created which the coffee shops did not meet. The tea-room pioneers in London were the Aerated Bread Company, familiarly known as the ABC. I think that coffee palaces in provincial industrial centres had been started, but as part of a temperance propaganda to counteract the attractions of the public house. The Aerated Bread Company was founded about the middle of the past century for the manufacture and sale of bread made under the patent aerated process of Dr. Dalgleish. The shops were opened for the sale of bread to the public for home consumption, but to give people an opportunity of testing it, facilities were provided for obtaining a cup of tea and bread and butter on the premises. This subsidiary object became in a short time the most important part of the company's business. It multiplied its shops, enlarged its bill of fare to include cooked foods, and while nowadays the ABC and its rival cater to many thousands daily, I doubt if anybody ever buys a loaf to take home. The fare in all these places is much alike, as are the general equipment, prices, and class of customers. They cater for a cheap class of business. In the busy centres, they are frequented mostly by young men and girl clerks, and shop assistants by women in town, shopping, and such like custom. Young employees can get a modest midday meal at a price to suit a shallow pocket. Before the war, the ruling price for a cup of tea and a roll and butter was 4p, and the general tariff in proportion. Nowadays, the war has run up prices at least 50%. During the worst times of food control, the fare was very scanty and very unappetizing. As a rule, it is plain and wholesome, with no pretense of being recherché. Tea is almost always very good, coffee not on the same level. Their tea rooms are all places designed for small, quick meals, and are in no sense lounges. Lions have refreshment houses of different grades. The popular cafe is a cut above the tea rooms, and so are the corner houses. 2 years ago the ABC amalgamated with Buzzards, an old establishment confectioner's in Oxford Street, a famous cake house. The Monaco and Gatti's appealed to a quite different class from that catered to by the tea shops, although perhaps not to what Mrs. Boffin would call the high flyers of fashion who frequent the lounges of the fashionable hotels. Gatti's original cafe was under the arches of Charing Cross Station. I may add about the Savoy that it was an outcome of the successful Gilbert and Sullivan operas of the 70s, D'Oyly Carte having expended some of his profits on building the hotel on a piece of waste ground by the Savoy Theatre. He brought over M. Ritz from Monte Carlo to manage the hotel and restaurant, and Escoffier, the greatest chef of the day, to preside over the cuisine. They made the Savoy famous for its dinners, and it has always maintained a high reputation, although Escoffier, who has now retired, ruled later at the Carlton, and Ritz at the hotel in Piccadilly, which bears his name. Bulgaria. In Bulgaria, Arabian-Turkish methods of making coffee prevail. The accompanying illustration shows a group in a caravan of the faithful on the annual pilgrimage to Mecca. The venerable Muslim, who is ambitious of becoming a Haji, is attended by his guards, distinguished by their fantastic dress, their glittering golden-hafted hanjars stuck in their shawl girdles, and their silver-mounted pistols, the grave turban replaced by a many-tasseled cap. Their accommodation is the stable of a khan, or serai, shared with their camel. Their refreshment is coffee, thick, black, and bitter, served by the kanji in tiny egg-shaped cups. In Denmark and Finland, coffee is made and served after the French and German fashion. France. Were it not for the almost inevitable high roast and frequently the disconcerting chicory addition, coffee in France might be an unalloyed delight. At least this is how it appears to American eyes. One seldom, if ever, finds coffee improperly brewed in France. It is never boiled. Second only to the United States, France consumes about 2 million bags of coffee annually. The varieties include coffee from the East Indies, Mocha, Haitian, a great favorite, Central American, Colombian, and Brazils. Although there are many wholesale and retail coffee roasters in France, home roasting persists, particularly in the country districts. The little sheet iron cylinder roasters that are hand-turned over an iron box holding the charcoal fire find a ready sale even in the modern department stores of the big cities. In any village or city in France, it is a common sight on a pleasant day to find the householder turning his roaster on the curb in front of his home. Emmett G. Beeson, in the Tea and Coffee Trade Journal, gives us this vignette of rural coffee roasting in the south of France. In a certain town in the south of France, I saw an old man with an outfit a little larger than the home variety, a machine with a capacity of about 10 pounds. Instead of a cylinder in which to roast his coffee, he had perched on a sheet iron frame a hollow round ball made of sheet iron. In the top of this ball there was a little slide which was opened by the means of a metal tool. In the sheet iron frame he had kindled his charcoal fire. Directly in front of his roaster was a homemade cooling pan, the sides of which were of wood, the bottom covered with a fine grade of wire screening. On this particular afternoon, the old man had taken up his place on the curb, and the big black cat had taken advantage of the warmth offered by the charcoal fire and was curled up, sleeping peacefully in the pan nearest the fire. The old man paid no attention to the cat, but went on rotating his ball of coffee and puffing away pensively on his cigarette. When his coffee had become blackened and burned it was, he stopped rotating the ball, opened the slide in the top, turned it over, and the hot, burned coffee rolled out, and much to his delight, on the sleeping cat, which leaped out of the pan and scampered up the street and into a hole under an old building. I afterward learned that this old fellow made a business of going about the town gathering up coffee from the houses along the way and roasting it at a few sous per kilo, much the same fashion as a scissors grinder plies his trade in an American town. Quite a few grocers roast their own coffee in crude devices much like those described above, but the large coffee roasters are gradually eliminating this sort of procedure. There are at Havre several roasters, but only two of importance. One does a business of about 250 bags a day, and the next largest has a capacity of about 160 bags a day. In Paris, there are many coffee roasters, some quite large, comparatively speaking, one having a capacity of about 750 bags a day. Shopkeepers in Paris and other large cities roast their coffee fresh daily. The machines used are of the ball or cylinder type, employing gas fuel and turned by electric power. Invariably, they stand where they may be seen from the street. Sample roasters, or testing tables, in France are conspicuous by their absence. Inquiry regarding this subject discloses that coffee is sold on description, and when the French trader is asked, "How do you know your delivery is up to description so far as cup quality is concerned?" he answers that this is arrived at from the general appearance and the smell of the coffee in the green. Perhaps one reason for the laxity in buying cup quality may be explained by the fact that coffee is roasted very high. In fact, it is burned almost to a charred state, and unless the coffee is unusually bad in character, the burned taste eliminates any foreign flavor it may have. The fact that coffee was, and still is, quite generally sold to the consumer green accounts for Central American coffees taking first place. Style takes preference over everything else when it comes to selling to a Frenchman. To the American coffee merchant, it seems that the French are carrying their artistic tastes to an unreasonable extreme when they apply them to coffee, for coffee is grown to drink and not to look at. Since the coming of the large coffee roaster, who delivers roasted coffee right down the line to the consumer, Santos has come in for its share of the business. The roasters are getting good results out of Santos blends, up to 50% and 60% with West Indian and Central American coffees. Rio is as much in disfavor in France as it is in the United States, perhaps more so. In Brittany, the demand is for pea-berry coffee, no matter of what variety. This comes about from the fact that the people of this section of the country still do a great deal of their roasting at home and have become accustomed to the use of pea-berry coffee because they do not have the improved hand roasters and still do a great deal of their roasting in pans in the ovens of their stoves. The pea-berry coffee rolls about so nicely in the pan that they get a much more uniform roast. Nearly all the coffee is ground at home, which is not a bad practice for the consumer, but perhaps works hardship on the dealer, who can mix some grade grinders into his blends without doing them any material harm. Where coffee mills are used in the stores, there are of the strong-arm family and of an ancient heritage. To get a growl out of the grocer in France, buy a kilo of coffee and ask him to grind it. Packaged coffee and proprietary brands have not come into their own to the extent that they have in the United States, although there are at present 2 firms in Paris which have started in this business and are advertising extensively on billboards, in streetcars, and in the subways. However, most coffee is still sold in bulk. The butter, egg, and cheese stores of France do a very large business in coffee. Prior to the war and high prices, there were some very large firms doing a premium business in coffee, tea, spices, etc. They still exist and have a very fine trade, But since the high prices of coffees and premiums, the business has gone down very materially. They operate by the wagon route and solicitor method, just as some of our American companies do. One very large firm in Paris has been in this business for more than 30 years, operating branches and wagons in every town, village, and hamlet in France. The consumption of coffee is increasing very materially in France. Some say on account of the high price of wine. Others hold that coffee is simply growing in favor with the people. Among the masses, French breakfast consists of a bowl or a cup of café au lait, or half a cup or bowl of strong black coffee and chicory, and half a cup of hot milk, and a yard of bread. The working man turns his bread on end and inserts it into his bowl of coffee, allowing it to soak up as much of the liquid as possible. Then he proceeds to suck this concoction into his system. His approval is demonstrated by the amount of noise he makes in the operation. Among the better classes, the breakfast is the same, café au lait, with rolls and butter and sometimes fruit. The brew is prepared by the drip, or true percolator method, or by filtration. Boiling milk is poured into the cup from a pot held in one hand together with the brewed coffee from a pot held in the other, providing a simultaneous mixture. The proportions vary from half and half to 1 part coffee and 3 parts milk. Sometimes the service is by pouring into the cup a little coffee and then the same quantity of milk, and alternating in this way until the cup is filled. Coffee is never drunk with any meal but breakfast, but is invariably served en demi-tasse after the noon and the evening meals. In the home, the usual thing after luncheon or dinner is to go into the salon and have your demi-tasse and liquor and cigarettes before a cozy grate fire. A Frenchman's idea of after-dinner coffee is a brew that is unusually thick and black, and he invariably takes it with his liquor, no matter if he has had a cocktail for an appetizer, a bottle of red wine with his meat course, and a bottle of white wine with the salad and dessert course. When the demi-tasse comes along, with it must be served his cordial in the shape of cognac, Benedictine, or crème de menthe. He cannot conceive of a man not taking a little alcohol with his after-dinner coffee as an aid, he says, to digestion. In Normandy, there prevails a custom in connection with coffee drinking that is unique. They produce in this province great quantities of what is known as cidre, made from a particular variety of apple grown there. In other words, just plain hard cider. However, they distill this hard cider, and from the distillation they get a drink called calvados. The man from Normandy takes half a cup of coffee and refills the cup with calvados, sweetened with sugar, and drinks it with seeming relish. Ice-cold coffee will almost sizzle when calvados is poured into it. It tastes like a corkscrew, and one drink has the same effect as a crack on the head with a hammer. From the toddling age up, the Norman takes his calvados and coffee. In the south of France, they make a concoction from the residue of grapes. They boil the residue down in water and get a drink called mac, and it is used in much the same way as the Norman in the north uses calvados. Then there is also the very popular summertime drink known as masgran, which in that region means seltzer water and cold coffee, or what Americans might call a coffee highball. Making coffee in France has been and will always be by the drip and the filtration methods. The large hotels and cafes follow these methods almost entirely, and so does the housewife. When company comes and something unusual in coffee is to be served, Mr. Beeson says he has known the cook to drip the coffee using a spoonful of hot water at a time, pouring it over tightly packed, finely ground coffee, allowing the water to percolate through to extract every particle of oil. They use more ground coffee in bulk than they get liquid in the cup, and sometimes spend an hour producing 4 or 5 demi-tasses. It is needless to say that it is more like molasses than coffee when ready for drinking. It is not unusual in some parts of France to save the coffee grounds for a second or even a third infusion, but this is not considered good practice. Von Liebig's idea of correct coffee making has been adapted to French practice in some instances after this fashion. Put used coffee grounds in the bottom chamber of a drip coffee pot. Put freshly ground coffee in the upper chamber. Pour on boiling water. The theory is that the old coffee furnishes body and strength, and the fresh coffee the aroma. The cafes that line the boulevards of Paris and the larger cities of France all serve coffee, either plain or with milk, and almost always with liquor. The coffee house in France may be said to be the wine house, or the wine house may be said to be the coffee house. They are inseparable. In the smallest or the largest of these establishments, coffee can be had at any time of day or night. The proprietor of a very large cafe in Paris says his coffee sales during the day almost equal his wine sales. The French, young or old, take a great deal of pleasure in sitting out on the sidewalk in front of a cafe, sipping coffee or liquor. Here they love to idle away the time just watching the passing show. In Paris, there are hundreds of these cafes lining the boulevards where one may sit for hours before the small tables reading the newspapers, writing letters, or merely idling. In the morning from 8 to 11, employees, men about town, tourists, and provincials throng the cafes for café au lait. The waiters are coldly polite. They bring the papers and brush the table twice for café crème, milk, and 3 times for café complet, with bread and butter. In the afternoon, café means a small cup or glass of café noir, or café nature. It is double the usual amount of coffee dripped by percolator or filtration device, the process consuming 8 to 10 minutes. Some understand café noir to mean equal parts of coffee and brandy with sugar and vanilla to taste. When café noir is mixed with an equal quantity of cognac alone, it becomes café gloria. Café masgrande is also much in demand in the summertime. The coffee base is made as for café noir, and it is served in a tall glass with water to dilute it to one's taste. A few of the cafes that made Paris famous in the 18th century survive. Among those that are notable for their coffee service are the Café de la Paix, Café de la Régence, founded in 1718, and the Café Prévost, noted also for chocolate after the theater. End of section 66.